welcome everybody. I'm impressed that so many people made it after the delightful gala last night. I myself set 3 different alarms to be sure that I made it. We're going to be looking at the everyday but extremely difficult work of creating strategy for growth. Specifically, we'll be looking at managing a portfolio of innovations, at figuring out the balance between local and global innovation, and at how we can understand the strange blurring of industry lines that is disrupting really everybody. And to help us do that, we've got a distinguished panel. If you looked in your book, you may have noticed that Vlatka Lupik is not with us today. She meant to be, but had a health situation and couldn't travel. So we're sorry about that, but we're delighted to have Michael Jacobides from the London Business School stepping in instead. And in the middle, we have Yves, the distinguished professor from INSEAD, and Rita McGrath, also just as distinguished from Columbia Business School. They'll be each giving a presentation, and between presentations, we're going to try to fit in a little bit of panel conversation, and then there will be time for questions from the audience at the end. So Rita, why don't you get us started?
I would be delighted. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to be back at the Drucker Forum. It's something I look forward to all year long. And what I'd like to share with you is some new research that we've been doing on growth and innovation and how that all ties together. And it was great to be in yesterday's session because so many of the examples and the concepts that we talked about yesterday. So Amazon, what are we to make of Amazon? How are we thinking about firms that are dealing with very competitive environments, that struggle with growth? Is there actually a role for growth? General Electric, all those things. We'll kind of touch on a number of those in the time that I've got. So I'd be delighted to entertain questions, after the session. So let's start with Amazon. And I love this symbolism that Jeff Bezos uses. He talks about day one, and his concept there is meant to symbolize come into work every day as though you are beginning, as though you're at the very start. Don't bring with you the legacy of what made you successful in the past. And I think it's an interesting symbolic phrase. And he takes this to a real extreme. So whenever he moves offices on the various Amazon campuses over the year, he renames the office building Day One, which I think is fascinating, right, as a sort of a mantra that he pursues. Amazon has also been very interesting in that it is a firm that really embodies this idea that Sarah touched on just now, which is the lines between industries are really getting blurry. The most significant competitor many of you will face is not even from your own traditional industry. It could be some other firm coming into your space. And a fabulous example of this is Amazon Web Services, which began as a 2-page white paper that a couple of insiders at Amazon wrote saying, hey, we've developed all this technology for our own use. Perhaps there are other firms that could benefit from taking advantage of this. Bezos gave it the green light. They went off to Florida. They created this service, right, which is basically computing power on demand. And Amazon Web Services was born. And as you can see from this graph, one of the fastest growing enterprise computing businesses of all time. And you may remember in the beginning when Bezos started this, there were howls of protest from all the analysts, and everyone said, this is ridiculous. You're a retailer. What are you doing getting into enterprise level computing, right? And we're seeing more and more of that. And so what I would argue is the conventional boundaries of industry, as we've been very comfortable talking about them for a long time, have actually started to blur and erode. And we're left with competing in what I call arenas, where an arena is a particular set of needs or customer job to be done, and various players are contesting to get that job done. And it doesn't really matter technically what industry you are in. What matters instead is how connected are you to the customer. And Bezos is famous for saying, look, as long as my competition's worried about us, as long as they're worried about other competitors, as long as we focus on the customer, we're going to be fine. And I think that's an interesting philosophy. Now, the part of the concept behind this panel is asking the question, well, is growth really important? Is it an imperative? And why? And I want to bring into this conversation our discussion with Steve and Alex and company yesterday about activist investors and how are we to think about this in a disciplined way. And I'd like to use the example of Buffalo Wild Wings. It's an American example for which I apologize, but you may know the story. There was this restaurant out in Buffalo, New York, where the winters are very long, and they invented this food called buffalo wings, right? Anybody had buffalo wings? All right, so you're familiar at least with the broad concept. And so this restaurant chain founded itself on the basis of let's commercialize buffalo wings. And they had a fantastic run of growth. And then I guess they just ran out of people who wanted to eat buffalo wings on a regular basis. And their growth started to slow. And what happened next was that they attracted an activist investor who, as Steve and others were talking about yesterday, said, sell off all the assets to your franchisees, take all the assets off your books, swap out your CEO, change your management, give us a bunch of board seats. We're going to tell you what to do. Of course, Buffalo Wild Wings management is sort of flailing under this assault and said, oh, no, we can turn it around, we can do better, blah, blah, blah. They lost, basically. Their CEO is fired, and they're now in full-out turnaround mode. And this got my colleagues and I thinking about, well, is there some metric, is there some measure we could use to start to understand when a company is going to be vulnerable to this kind of thing? And we've developed something we call the imagination premium. And what that is by using the capital asset pricing model, doing some calculations involving a company's market capitalization and its cash flow, what you can essentially do is parse out what the markets are saying a company is worth. Now, these are public companies. We haven't figured out how to do it for private companies yet, but for public companies, how much of your value comes from growth from operations versus growth from ongoing future prospects. So how much are you doing that's from today's cash flow versus tomorrow's options for growth? And some observations I would make just looking at this chart. Look at Amazon. About a quarter of Amazon's market capitalization comes from what it actually produces in terms of free cash flow. Everything else is this growth story Bezos is telling investors. So very, very high imagination premium, which is essentially the value of growth divided by the value of operations. Poor old Buffalo Wild Wings on the bottom of that chart, not only do they not have much of an imagination premium, but the markets are basically saying, we expect you to shrink. We think you're gonna get smaller. And various companies have various different ways of looking at this. So our hypothesis is that too high, and that's not great, except for maybe unusual cases like Amazon. Tesla, for example. There was a brief shining moment last summer where Tesla was actually worth more than Ford, even though Tesla has lost money basically forever. So Volvo makes an announcement that they're ending the internal combustion engine as we know it within a specific time frame, and Tesla loses $10 billion of market capitalization in a matter of about a week. So too high, very frothy, not great. Too low, and now you're in Buffalo Wild Wings territory. We talked yesterday about General Electric a bit, and if you look at GE's, what you see is their imagination premium is about 0.49, which is not brilliant relative to their competitors. What that basically says is the market does not believe their growth story. Now, I'm not saying investors are omniscient or anything like that, and I'm not one to put too much faith in what the markets are telling us to do with our companies. However, it is at least one metric that's a counterweight to what's your return on capital, what are your return on investment, the standard metrics that we use. So my hope is that we can start to build a counterweight, which basically says, look, if you're not investing for long-term growth, you're going to be in Buffalo Wild Wings, dare I say it, GE territory. And so as investors, we have a right to ask, what's your growth story? How are you going to deliver more growth? So our hypothesis is this: too low, not great, investor, activist territory; too high, not great, frothy, excessive, speculative, kind of Dutch tulip bulb territory. So as a leader, what I think you want to be aiming for is somewhere in between. Somewhere where there's a nice balance between your growth story and your operational story. And I think that's something we talked about a lot yesterday. To me, this metric begins to give us some ways of thinking about that in a very disciplined way. So let me try to make this very practical and concrete for you. If you think about the value you create as a leader, as a manager, and you map that against levels of uncertainty in your business. When uncertainty is very low, it's predictable. You know, tomorrow's going to be like today. It's very much a certainty. The organization I work for is kind of like that, right? We pretty much know how many MBAs we're going to have in our program next year, and it's going to be a lot like how many we had this year. And in those situations, you actually can use conventional metrics, present value, return on investment, whatever the particular value that you have, that we teach in business schools. You can kind of use that. As you begin to get into more uncertain circumstances, more and more of the value you're creating is this option value, which I think is highly correlated to this imagination premium, where option value is the right, but not the obligation to make a choice in the future. So the kind of investments Steve was talking about yesterday, which are basically very high upside, quite significant uncertainty, but ideally a known and contained downside, those are examples of options. And different kinds of options have different things they do for you depending on where they lie in your portfolio. So this chart's a slightly different flavor of what Steve already talked about yesterday, which is the 3-horizon model. This is a somewhat more nuanced model. Honestly, I don't care which one you use. My plea to you is have some kind of model that distinguishes between the investments we're making today and the investments that we're making that take us into the future. So, a very traditional way of breaking up the world, right? On the bottom we have uncertainty about markets. On the side we have uncertainty about technologies and capabilities. And when those uncertainties are very low, you're in the world of what I call enhancements to the core business. So enhancement launches. They can be very innovative, but they're basically all about keeping today's business healthy and happy and chugging along. And that's got to be priority one. If you don't get that right, you don't have the resources to do anything else. So you've got to do that well. Moving out a step in uncertainty, you have new platforms. These are new arenas for growth. Some people call them adjacencies. In these two areas, conventional management, conventional allocations of resources make a lot of sense. Once you get to that outer level of uncertainty, what Steve calls the Horizon 3, McKinsey calls it that, I call them options. Again, they're the same idea, basically. Then the rules change. Now you're in the world of test a little, learn a lot. Spend a little bit of resource to get you access to some as yet unknown upside. And different kinds of options, I would argue, have a different job to do for you. So in the case where I kind of know or suspect there's going to be some kind of future demand, but I don't yet know what the solution is, that's where you take out positioning options. I'm going to make a small bet on some new technology or new way of doing business that keeps my options open until I have the confidence to make a bigger bet. Different situation than when I'm taking something I know how to do and moving that into some kind of new area or arena. That's a case where I want to be doing prototyping. I want to be doing testing. Let me give you a just quick example. So there's a company I work with out in San Francisco. They're called Varo Money, V-A-R-O Money. And their target market segment is income secure but cash flow challenged millennials. So very specific market segment they're after. So here's the idea. I have a job, so I have steady income that comes in the door, but I'm in my 20s or 30s, and my friends are getting married, I'm setting up a new house, I buy a used car because I can't yet afford to buy a new car, so I have car repairs to think about. So I have these things that challenge my cash flow. And the idea behind this bank is, among the services they will provide, is they'll give you an alternative to credit financing for when you have these uneven cash flows at very favorable rates. And the way that they do this is they connect with you on your mobile phone. So they have no branches, they don't have tellers, none of that stuff. They've got a chat bot on a mobile phone. So one of the big questions they had to think about was, remember, these are millennials, right? And so should the mobile interface be kind of, hey dude, looks like you're having some problems this week, do you want us to step in and help you out, with a little emoji, right? The other alternative, right, is being very serious. So, Mr. Robertson, we noticed, given your current rate of charges, that you may be experiencing a cash flow issue. Here's the following products we could offer. Now, in a typical company, how would that question get resolved? the highest paid person in the room would weigh in and make the decision, right? In today's environment, you don't have to do that. You can actually do like an A/B test. And what they found, and there was huge argument about this, nobody really knew what the right answer was. Huge argument, so they did an A/B test, and what they found out was very interesting. You may be perfectly happy to chat with your friends on Venmo or whatever when it comes to that sort of transaction. When it comes to your money, you want to be treated like a grown-up. And you do not want to be called dude, and you do not want emojis. What you want is Mr. Robertson, with deep respect, I observe that, whatever it is. Now, the reason I think that's an interesting illustration is they had the technology, they knew how to do it. What they didn't know was, how do I appeal to this new market segment? Kind of an interesting thing. So bear that example in mind as you think about experimenting in these new arenas. Now, farthest out of all, this is the wacky stuff, right? This is what's artificial intelligence going to do to the future of manufacturing? Who knows? What I recommend there is you find some kind of early market that provides you with a step to some kind of future. Now, it's not the ultimate market that you want to be in, but it's a step in that general direction. And very often, it's not the kind of situation where you can really bet with confidence. What you can do, though, is find some place that can help take a step along the way. And here's a great example. So take 3D printing. A lot of buzz about 3D printing, right? This is an awesome thing. And the future is going to be amazing. We wake up in the morning and we decide we want a piece of toast. So we use our handset or our face recognition enabled device to print us a toaster. And it's going to make us a piece of toast. And then when we're done with it, we just melt it down and it goes and makes something else. And this is going to be awesome, right? We're not quite there yet, right? 3D printing has a long way to go before it really takes part of our daily life. So here's an example of an entrepreneur that found a market that was actually deeply in need of a solution that no existing technology had been able to provide. And this market consists of kids who, either because of birth defects or because they've had accidents, have not got fingers. They don't have the use of their fingers. And that's really sad. And existing prosthetic technology doesn't work to solve that problem because it's very expensive and children grow. So these poor kids, they have trouble playing sports, doing a lot of things you'd like to do as a child. It's very, very challenging. Well, so what this guy dreamed up is he said, wait a minute, we could use 3D printing in its current level of development, as is, to create these fingers, to create artificial hands, basically. And when the kids grow out of them, that's fine. They just melt them down and make new ones. Even better. The hands do not have to look like people hands. They can look like Wolverine hands or Batman hands. And now when the kids go to school, all the other kids look at them and they go, why can't I have Wolverine hands? That's so cool, right? Now, thankfully, small market, clearly defined problem for which someone is willing to pay to have a solution, right? That's what a stepping stone's really looking for. Now, very often what happens right about now is people will say to me, well, what's the right mix? And my argument is going to be the right mix is a function of your strategy. And this comes up a lot in my world anyway. Is strategy in a highly uncertain environment of any use whatsoever? Why don't we just try everything and see what works? And I actually don't agree with that very much. I think strategy helps you make choices. It helps you decide where to put your resources. It helps you make choices. And it's even more important when things are really uncertain. You have to figure out what direction you want to go in. So here's an example. This is a company that makes super glamorous medical devices, so incontinence treatments and heart stents and body fluid containers of various kinds. Did you stop? Are we done?
Yep, getting close.
Like
Getting
7
close.
minutes.
I'm sorry?
7 minutes
Oh.
over.
Am I at 10 minutes? Oh.
7 minutes over.
All right, so I'll skip up. So let me just finish on some practical implications. I did not know that. Sorry. Okay, first practical implication is your strategy is going to determine the mix of what you're working on. In your core, you really want to invest in supporting today's business. New platforms, you want to invest in extending that business. In options, small investments that are going to teach you what's happening next. I think it's very easy to do an initial cut of this. So get a big sheet of paper, get a bunch of sticky notes, figure out where you are. And that'll give you some insight into whether you're having that balance I talked about between today's business and investing for the future. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. we just got a tiny bit off time, so I'm going to skip the questions on this one and move straight on to Yves. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I've been looking at my own research and thinking about this question of inclusive growth, and I'm going to start with a little personal story. It's a story of my glasses. A few months ago, I went to an ophthalmologist in Fontainebleau. It's a small town where I live in France. He gave me a prescription. I took the prescription to a local optical shop, and I said, I need new glasses. This was on a Tuesday morning. They said, okay, come back next Saturday at the end of the week. Give us 5 days, you will have your glasses. What I didn't know is that same Tuesday, my glasses prescription was scanned and sent to Carl Zeiss in Germany, who engineered the glasses. The specs of the glasses immediately were sent to PPG, Pittsburgh Plate Glass, who did the blanks. The blanks were sent from the US to Japan, same day, Wednesday probably, I don't know exactly. Nikon made all kinds of polishing and coating and finishing and so on and so forth. And by the Friday, at the end of the week, my glasses were back in Fontainebleau, done. And essentially, all what the local shop did was to cut them right so they would fit into the frame. So the company doing this is a French company called Essilor. Essilor started as a nearly bankrupt, the merger of two nearly bankrupt small optical companies in eastern France in the 1970s. It's now the world leader by far on optical glasses. It recently acquired Luxottica. It's now penetrating and developing low-end glasses for emerging markets and so on. And it's an amazing example because it's a company which is really has established a global supply system, a global technology system, a global innovation system. It's actually, interestingly enough, veered off into consultancy for companies like Walmart, and they also helped Amazon, actually, of all companies, basically design global supply systems. Why am I bringing this up? Now, you can tell me it's inclusive, but it's only inclusive in the triad. Yes, of course, it's France, Germany, Japan, the US, and so on. But what we have seen recently is companies that operated in the old model, which is essentially, I do my stuff at home, I innovate there, close to my heart and close to my mind, and then I project the results of my innovation around the world, basically in an outward move. So, I set up plants, I set up operations, I spread around the world, but more in a market development mode than in anything else. What we have seen is the companies which do that suffer, whereas the companies that have a completely different approach, which is much more coherent with the objectives of inclusive growth, these companies which say, where in the world can I find the best possible competencies? Where could I conceivably develop them if they don't exist? And how do I build a global innovation system and a global sourcing system, which is going to allow me to get the best out of all these distributed competencies. And that's really the basic idea there, is to say, when you start thinking of it, companies that grow, again, Essilor started from next to nothing, and it's now a multi-billion-dollar company, the world leader in optical glasses by far. What you find there is companies that have moved in this way have been remarkably successful. Companies that have remained for too long in this close to the heart, close to the mind, let's do it at home and project it onto the world, have typically not been growing and have even been failing. A contrast is another company I studied very recently in some depth, which is the adventures of Nokia in mobile phones, where after they were very, very successful in the 90s, in a very traditional mode of Finland having, for fortuitous reasons we could go into but don't have time, after having started with Finland as the heart, and Finland having a lead in the development of mobile phones, it's partly geography, it's partly geopolitics, it's partly history. There are many factors playing into this. In a sense, Finland made Nokia's success, but Finland also unmade Nokia's success later on, because Nokia remained very, very Finnish. Yes, they did create some R&D operations around the world, but they went to California, for instance, which was the most obvious location where to go. But they only did this in 2007. They did not do it at scale. They had a couple hundred people kind of tucked away in a little building in Palo Alto. They linked to China to an extent, but they did not fully capitalize on China. They did not capitalize on other parts of the world where, like India, Israel, Eastern Europe, Russia, where in a sense there were pent-up skills, reserved skills, largely because these were places which had not benefited from abundant computing power. And therefore, you still had mathematicians and computer scientists and so on who were working with paper pads and pencils and erasers, and that kept much better skills than the people in the West who had benefited from cheap and abundant computing power. So Nokia remained very Finnish, remained very Finland-centric, did not really, despite some efforts, have the right set of antennas, the right sensing capabilities to fully understand what was taking place with the Internet revolution, which was driven out of Silicon Valley and basically the US West Coast, did not understand that the innovation regime in telephony was shifting from this very controlled process, collaborative process in Europe around the GSM standard, into a much more entrepreneurial, much less controlled, internet-based, ebullient innovation process, mostly in California, to some extent also in Oregon and in Washington State. They did set up, for instance, an R&D center in Vancouver in Canada. The logic was good. The logic was to say Vancouver is one of the most cosmopolitan high-tech cities in the world. It's the new center of movie making, video entertainment, and so on. In Canada, it's moving from Montreal to the west. Great. The problem there is you went there a few years later, what did you find? You found middle-aged, gray-haired Finnish scientists sent from northern Finland for a few years at a time, running this lab in Vancouver. Would they connect very easily with the ebullient teenage young people community, the Chinese, and so on? No. They lived in a little Finnish cluster by themselves, and they worked by themselves. Result? Not much. So there is also this question of it's not only going there, it's being connected, getting the right links, building the right links. And it's also bringing it home or creating this global network. It's what Essilor has done remarkably well. It's what Nokia didn't ever do. A contrast to Nokia again, perhaps if you stay with Silicon Valley for a second, is you look at SAP, the other big, traditional European IT company. Now, SAP, of course, was already doing software in a way, so perhaps the hurdles were less for them, whereas Nokia had two problems at the same time. One was moving from hardware to software, and one was moving from a European-centric to a California-centric innovation process. But SAP, you go now to Palo Alto, if you drive into the hills behind Stanford University, you suddenly come across a set of huge buildings tucked away in the hills. It's the SAP West Coast R&D Center, and there are thousands of people working there for SAP, and SAP today has become actually very California-centric. But it's also drawing on capabilities from all around the world. So the core message here is a very simple one. It is to say, if you want growth, if you want inclusive growth, you have to spread away from your home base and transform yourself into a global innovator, mobilizing the best resources around the world, a la Essilor, and not remain hostage to where you started from, like, unfortunately, Nokia became. So that's kind of the key challenge. Now, can this be extended beyond developed countries? Yes. Certainly India, China, there are places in Africa. We were discussing yesterday the development of mobile payment and so on in Kenya, for instance. But there are places in Africa where some very, very innovative skills are being developed and they are emerging. Same was true in Brazil a few years ago, probably may still be true. Morocco, we mentioned Tunisia yesterday, but Morocco is another remarkable country where there is a lot of capability being developed around aerospace engineering, automotive engineering, and so on and so forth. So that model can easily spread, not to probably the most underdeveloped areas in the world. So if you tell me, let's go to South Sudan on that basis, also because we spoke about the unfortunate situation in South Sudan last night, probably not. But can we go to most of Africa? Can we go to all of Asia? Can we go to most of Latin America? Yes, of course. So my sense is there is a need to rethink globalization. There is a need to rethink globalization in a much more inclusive way, in a much more distributed way, where the idea is not market, the idea is competencies. How can I get into the world and basically compose my own frame, my own set of capabilities, integrate them on a global basis, which requires managerial capabilities of some magnitudes, which also requires innovation processes that can move from one country to the next. Another example, and I know there are a couple of L'Oréal people in this room, is L'Oréal, which has been moving innovation skills, process skills, from Asia into Europe and the rest of the world. So not just learning new technologies, but learning the ways to develop new technologies, kind of second-order learning, which is much more demanding. So companies which do this grow. Companies which do this do something useful for the development of the world, do something useful for the countries in which they operate. Companies that don't essentially fall victim to keeping too much of a home-centric perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves. I think I'm still going to try and get us back on time, so let's skip the questions now and wait till afterwards and move right on to Michael.
Rightio. So it's great to be with you today, and what I'll do is that I'll continue where I was teed off by Rita a moment ago, and I'll speak about what she called arenas, which is the ways in which competition is transformed, which is what I've spent the best part of the last 2 decades studying. And I'd like to share a few observations in terms of the exact ways in which the world is changing and what we can do about it. So, first of all, let's think about the change in who are the 5 top companies by market capitalization. And this is a story that you guys may know. But what you will see if you look back in 2006, it's the expected mix. You have a large oil company, 2 large oil companies. You have one of the biggest manufacturing companies in the world, GE, and then you have a major bank. By 2016, you have GAFA and Microsoft. Now, why is it? Is it the case that the world is changing and all of a sudden we're starting to consume technology? Turns out that's not the answer. This chart shows each of the sectors in the S&P, and you can see what part of the total market capitalization of the S&P exists. Now, what you will see is that technology is not at its peak. Y2K, remember, that was its peak. It's gone down, and it's at a sensible level. And the question is, what is going on here? We are consuming more technology, but this isn't really just technology. What is it? How many of you know Ant Financial? Can I see hands up? A rather disconcerting minority. Now, what is Ant Financial? Ant Financial is part of the Alibaba Group, and if you want to know how much Ant Financial is worth, when it went out for its pre-IPO, getting a bit of spare cash from the capital markets, it gathered $4.5 billion. It's worth over 60 billion, making it by far the most valuable fintech in humanity. The question is, why? Well, what Alibaba had, Alipay, which then morphed into Ant Financial, is a heck of a lot of data and a heck of a lot of connections to the customers. And what it has today is nearly 500 million people that do payment, 150 million people in terms of wealth management, and about nearly 400 million people for whom it gives insurance. Now, this is part of a broader pattern. And the broader pattern is that the new winners that we see are not primarily technological firms. They don't make their money out of technology. We call them technology. That is a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding. The way that they make their money is by being able to change the way sectors are actually structured. They are the ones that are reshuffling the architecture of their sectors, changing how they compete, and behind them lie new rules for being successful. And that's the important thing, because I think that competitive landscape is changing, and as it is changing, we change the way that we make money. Let me show you share some more thoughts in terms of how things are changing. I'm sure you would not find this picture to be familiar at all. It seems some people do. Now, if you think about what is happening here, and that's, I guess, the bigger challenge, is that firms like Amazon or Google are really concerned of trying to find Siri and Alexa because they want to create an interface between you and the rest of the world. Industrial companies, service integrators, want to do exactly the same thing. The question is why? Well, consider what these two quotes from this year's Nobel laureate in economics say. These are the first two quotes that Google came up with. I didn't choose them. Dick Taylor says that the combination of loss aversion with mindless choosing implies that if an option is designated as the default, it'll attract a large market share, and that the choice architect has a responsibility for organizing the context in which people make decisions. So hello world, hello privacy, but basically hello profitability. What you see happening in terms of the way that competitive strategy is moving, and you can think about how these companies are starting to be embedded in all parts of the value add, is to be able to have a disproportionate impact in the way that we make our choices. And that is a good illustration of what has been happening underneath the surface, changing competitive dynamics. So what do we see? We see sectors unbundling, and we see the formation of networks. If you think about growth, you have the possibility of some firms growing without assets. And compare and contrast two players that are involved in hotels. Think about the Groupe Accor, one of the biggest and most successful hotel groups, employing nearly 500,000 people. Makes good profits. We teach about it when we speak about value curves and the rest of it. Makes 5.4 billion. Now, Booking.com with 8,000 people made 5.8 billion. Why? Because it has managed its ecosystem, it's managed to create a bottleneck, and it's managed to design the rest of the world around it. Now, what I think that strategy in profitable growth is about is who will commoditize whom. And thinking about how you can move into the areas that are not just valuable because they are a good value proposition. That's nice, that's cool. It isn't enough. It basically isn't even the point. So the first thing is to become more important to the final customer. The second thing is to stay only where you have to and think how you can make your complementers more replaceable. And finally, trying to become a bottleneck by leveraging your collaborators' immediate needs, because nobody is fully rational, and the problems in terms of the short versus longer time horizon means that you can try to change and reshape your sector, become at the core of it, taking advantage of the opportunities that others provide. Now, I've been studying industries for a long time, and I'd like to share just one set of examples that comes from the automotive industries. The last 2 days in London Business School, we had a meeting with all the big and the great in the automobile sector. And believe you me, the automobile sector is in turmoil like we have never seen before, and it is starting to change. Now, in the past, you could say, look, the automobile OEMs capture all the value. What are these graphs? These graphs show you which part of the total market capitalization comes to different parts of the value chain. On the left, you can see that in computers, the value has shifted from the vertically integrated computer manufacturers like IBM and Dell, and it's started going to the people making software and CPUs, whereas in cars, for all of the outsourcing, it still is the automobile companies that manage all the value in relative terms. And so far, they said life is good. Why? Well, because if you think about the structure, and that's where it starts being interesting, because we start digging up the underlying stuff, in terms of the structure, the automobiles were a closed hierarchical structure with the suppliers having closed group of firms that they work with, whereas in computers, the crucial mistake that IBM understood a little too late is that it opened up, creating open ecosystems, and Microsoft and Intel grabbed the customer. Who the heck would have known that we would know people with a blue drum saying Intel inside, becoming visible to you, signifying quality, and becoming the ones that capture the value. And we thought that is good, because we've created, OEM manufacturers thought, a good way of keeping them out, even if the cars are absolutely dreadful in terms of helping your communication devices. You can't even plug your bloody phone or iPhone device. Why? Because they didn't want them to go anywhere close. The problem is that the world is changing, and that's what's exciting now, because you have an increasing modularization, an onslaught of technology, and with this onslaught of technology, all bets are off, and we're moving to a digitally enabled, customer-centric world, whereby you have the needs of different players that can be served by system integrators. What we are seeing is that the opportunities are no longer in a sector, but you see meta-sectors, or groups of sectors that create ecosystems. Why? Because all of the cool stuff that we now need touches a number of different technologies, touches a number of different sectors, and as a result, you need someone who's going to be managing the engagement with all of that. That's why you now see automobile companies freaking out, trying to retake control of their ecosystem. You also see the suppliers doing the same thing. And the interesting challenge is they don't know how to manage it. And right now, they're spending money willy-nilly. $1 billion here, 500 million there, without thinking how they will redesign the ecosystem and just throwing money to the problem, which is not going to work. So, how can you grow in such a changing context? I think that my bit here is that you need to reinvent your strategy. You need to redefine your value add, having the customer and their digital options in mind. B2B players need to be B2B2C or to stakeholders. B2C players need to be C2B, system integrators of the needs that you're actually creating. Building capabilities in managing and aligning very diverse partners, much more so than you had in the past, and managing your ecosystems. You need to redefine your scope and your business model. You need to purge and divest. You need to acquire and invest. And you need to build a realistic map of what you can do and what you cannot. And it's the lack of reality that I am concerned with in terms of the boardrooms. And finally, you need to revisit your processes, your structures, and your clock speed. If you've got a sector with 3 or 4 years of development time, and all of a sudden you move in services that have weeks or months as a development time, there is a number of decision-making processes that will need to be revised, that need to be rethought, because you are not built for the world that you have. So let me leave you with this illustration of how I see some firms preparing for the future, and hopefully start the conversation in what's changing and how we should do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Let me start by asking the panelists if they'd like to comment on or ask questions of one another. No? Okay.
I might jump on to what Yves was speaking about, because I think that the two things that we covered are connected, are joined in the hip. If you think about one of the biggest changes in terms of globalization, if you think at the macro level, the growth of India and the growth of China, they are related to the unbundling of production. The growth of manufacturing in China originally, and then the growth of service industry and the support industry in terms of software development or customer service in India, that was part and parcel, and also then the cause of more unbundling and more restructuring that is happening within firms. So, you know, some of the changes that we see in terms of the way that industries and firms are organized and the globalization dynamics seem to be joined. What strikes me as really interesting is that what we know in terms of how to manage your own ecosystem or your own operations is that it's really important to know more than you do, and to be a little bit just at the margin, integrated in parts of the value chain where you're not active. My concern is that many firms say, I'll outsource this, and wonderful, it's going to go to Bangalore, or it's going to go to Guangzhou, and I won't have to think about it, as opposed to having teams on the ground that have antennas to sense and respond. You spend more time thinking about the global dynamics. Do you see them responding to more intelligent integration with the people that they source in other parts of the world?
Yeah, actually, if I stay with Essilor for a minute more, what you find is the product development, major new innovations like the darkening glasses when there is sun and so on that they have done. That is geographically distributed. It is done in collaboration with some of these partner companies like Nikon and so on, but it's very controlled from a management process and project management standpoint by Essilor. So at the knowledge creation end of understanding enough about the distributed knowledge of all the various partners and what do they bring to the fore, Essilor still keeps running the show and still keeps integrating the knowledge. From an operational standpoint, then the work is being performed in a distributed way in various parts of the world. And that's what I've seen also in a variety of other companies, for instance, in IT operations with India or in machinery with China and so on. So yes, there is this knowledge integration, and at the same time there is operational distribution, if you wish, or operational delocalization and outsourcing at the same time. Absolutely.
Thank you. Let's see if we've got, just have to get past these lights. Have we got audience members that'd like to raise questions? Yeah? Have we got a mic? Thanks.
Good save.
Thank you. I'm
No
Donald
sacrifice
from
is too great.
Ungarn, Hungary. Nice to meet you. Two questions. Coming back to the yesterday morning reframing question idea. First one, what do you think about the future of the global value chains when the robotization is going to change the assembly lines? Will it not increase inequality further in the world? This is one. And the second, how you evaluate the future of these value chains from a strategic point of view? They're getting too powerful, I think. I remember when AT&T was cut into pieces because it was too large and actually ruined competition. What about these UIT businesses? Are they not getting to be too powerful? What about cutting them? Thank you.
Two complicated questions. Please weigh in on either of them.
Yeah. I can probably comment on the first one. I'm not totally sure I exactly got the question, but let me make one comment if I understood it right, which is, it seems to me the key issue and the key advantage, and you can tell me, yes, but this may not generate enough employment and the skills may or may not be there, but the key advantage is around knowledge creation, innovation, R&D, product development, and so on. And that's going to, at least for a while, remain relatively immune to robotization. The question of robotization is going to decrease the advantages of distributed worldwide supply chains for obvious reasons, because labor cost differentials are a very ephemeral, short-term kind of phenomenon, and they converge very quickly, and robotization is going to make them less relevant anyway. And because they have converged, robotization will be even more attractive to companies. So I think the manufacturing work is going to be very, very dangerously compromised, which also says that, and it's back to what we were hearing about Tunisia yesterday, what I observe in Morocco and in other countries, it's the investment in education, the investment in innovation capabilities, the investment in technology is absolutely essential. In some cases, it's fortuitous. Israel was not a terribly advanced economy until the massive migration into Israel of computer scientists and IT specialists from Russia started in the 80s, booming in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, transformed the country into a high-tech powerhouse. In many other cases, it has to be government policy, it has to be engineered, it has to take more time, it's more difficult. But I think the future is around innovation-driven, distributed processes.
If I may weigh in, I think that these are terrific questions. I think that we have an issue here, and that the issue is even bigger than meets the eye. What has been happening with the unbundling and the reorganization of production is that you are essentially allowing the firms that are creating value not to be constrained by the growth of the other operations that they needed to integrate. So essentially, there used to be a dampener in terms of growth, and now you're like, well, I don't need to grow my own operations to make money. So think about the hotel example that I give you. You have a terrific setup, even if you want to grow with franchise. It'll take you time to educate the franchisors and so on and so forth. It slows down competition. It slows the inequality of profit distribution. Whereas now, with a world that is more modular and interconnected, if there is an extraordinary advantage, it can scale up much more quickly, and you see that in the very rapid increase and occasional decrease of the value that exists. So at the general level, yes, we are moving in a world of jerkier shifts. What makes it much more interesting, and I think dangerous, is the growth of platform-based competition. And this is something that, unfortunately, and I'm speaking as someone who has been trained as an economist and then converted working in terms of strategy, the traditional economists that think of regulation do not yet understand. And this is a big problem, especially in the United States. Europe has the reflexes of being a little more concerned with the excessive power of those that orchestrate ecosystems, call the shots, and essentially create these vast asymmetries. We need to start thinking about them at a number of different levels. How do you get the governance of ecosystems and the way that you allow people in and out? We're only now starting to study this kind of stuff, and it's really exciting, but it hasn't translated into the policy arena. And if you think it at a simple human level, which is, I think, where the other question that you were asking is going, how do we think about the changing engagement of some firms with people who are neither employees nor agents? In the UK, Uber lost another extremely important legal battle just last week. And that is that 19 drivers said, we should be treated as employees, not as agents. So it'll be interesting as our laws, in terms of how individuals connect with platforms, need to adjust to this reality, which is not employment versus not employment, which is the reality that we're now living in. So the same dynamics, not only at the sectoral level, but the organizational level. Lots to answer, not enough time.
Yeah, I think that your second question is such a huge question that we're all going to be struggling with it for the next few years. Thank you for that. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. Are there any final comments about anything, especially Rita, because you've been quiet the last 20 minutes?
Which is uncharacteristic. I guess I'd like to bring two issues into the conversation. The first is that one of the things we're grappling with that's new is the value that's created by network effects. So imagine to yourself you're the only person on a dating site. Like you're the only one there. I mean, unless you're a complete narcissist, that has zero value, right? And it only adds value when you have, lots more people on that site. So one of the things that's new and that we're seeing these ecosystems leveraging is this power of networks. So the more people are on Facebook, the happier you are to be on Facebook. The more people are on Google, the more advertisers will pay to be on Google. And I don't think our regulatory regimes have caught up with that yet.
Let me give a friendly amendment, though, to what Rita just said. This is true, but it is not characteristic of most parts of the economy. Furthermore, not only are network externalities true in a given number of segments, and I think that where the research is now moving is to try to distinguish where do they exist, where do they not exist, because if you are in a segment with no network externalities, trying to have a Facebook-type strategy, you're going to fall flat on your face, and you're going to waste your shareholders' money. So I think that creating a slightly more nuanced framework is very important. Understanding where they work is very important. And another thing that we found in recent research to be very important is, for instance, fungibility. Now let me give you the example of the ultimate setup. Android and iOS. And think that you're an app maker, and you will make something for Android, or you will make something for the iOS and Apple. You care about Android if you make for Android. You care about Apple if you make for Apple. However, if what you write for Apple can be instantaneously be turned for an Android thing, your allegiance to Apple and Android has just gone down. Why? It isn't network externality, it is the fungibility, is the extent to which you do something which is valuable only in a given group of firms. Back to strategy. Where I compete and how I compete may be driven by how fungible my investment is. If I drive an ecosystem, do I want to make it very specific, or do I want to make it very open? Again, interesting strategy questions, interesting policy questions. Do we want to standardize? So I think that we need to move not only to recognize the network effects, and I'm totally in agreement with Rita, but then say, what do they mean and what are the implications?
Thank you. That's a great place to stop. I'll just say one last thing, which is that when I started editing strategy articles, I had a sense of a grand theory of strategy that worked and described the world. I don't think there is one anymore. So that fascinates me, because you guys have some work to do. We need a new grand theory of strategy.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much, panelists.
Everybody.